The October wind cut through the streets of Cedar Falls, Wyoming, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of an early winter. Sarah Martinez pulled her wool scarf higher around her neck, not against the cold, but to hide the jagged scar that ran from her left ear to the corner of her mouth, a permanent reminder of the house fire that had claimed her parents 3 years ago. At 26, Sarah had learned to navigate the world with her head down, her dark hair deliberately falling across the left side of her face like a curtain. She'd perfected the art of turning her right profile toward conversations, of sitting in corners of coffee shops, of avoiding mirrors whenever possible. But today she couldn't avoid what was coming. The brass nameplate on the office door read, "Henderson and Associates Legal Services," and Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the handle. Inside, the reception area buzzed with the quiet efficiency of a small-town law firm. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in an unforgiving glare that made Sarah instinctively touch her scarf. Sarah Martinez, a young receptionist with perfectly styled blonde hair, looked up from her computer, her smile faltering almost imperceptibly when she caught sight of Sarah's face. It was a reaction Sarah had grown accustomed to, the momentary pause, the slight widening of eyes, the quick recovery that never quite erased the initial shock. "Yes, that's me," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Henderson will see you now. Third door on the right." The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, lined with certificates and photographs of the firm's successful cases. Sarah's boots, practical, worn leather ones that had belonged to her father, echoed against the polished floors. She paused outside Henderson's office, gathering the courage she'd been building for weeks. James Henderson was a man in his 50s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He gestured to the chair across from his mahogany desk, and Sarah noticed how he maintained eye contact without flinching, a small kindness that meant more than he could know. "Miss Martinez, I'm sorry for your loss," he began, shuffling through a stack of papers. "I know it's been 3 years, but legal matters sometimes take time to resolve, especially when there are insurance disputes involved." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. The fire had been ruled an electrical accident, but the insurance company had fought the claim for months, leaving Sarah in a legal limbo that had drained her savings and her hope. "I have some good news," Henderson continued. "The settlement has finally been approved. After legal fees and outstanding debts, you'll receive $89,000. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. It wasn't enough to rebuild her life in Denver, where she'd been scraping by as a freelance graphic designer, working from her tiny studio apartment and avoiding face-to-face client meetings. But it was enough for something else, something she'd been dreaming about during the long, sleepless nights when the memories of flames and sirens wouldn't leave her alone. "There's something else," Henderson said, pulling out a separate folder. "Your great-aunt Magdalena left you property in her will. It's been tied up in probate, but it's finally cleared. A ranch about 40 miles west of here, near Millbrook." Sarah's heart skipped. She barely remembered Aunt Magdalena, her father's eccentric sister who'd chosen the isolation of ranch life over family gatherings. A ranch? About 200 acres, with a main house and some outbuildings. "I'll be honest with you, the place needs work. It's been empty for 2 years, and the previous caretaker wasn't exactly thorough. But the land is good, and the house has good bones." As Henderson spread out photographs of the property, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: possibility. The house was a weathered 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch, set against a backdrop of rolling hills and endless sky. The barn was faded red, and there were corrals that spoke of horses and cattle, of a life lived in harmony with the land. "I know you're from the city," Henderson said gently, "but if you're thinking of making a fresh start—" "I am," Sarah said quickly, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "I want to see it." 2 hours later, Sarah was following Henderson's pickup truck down a dirt road that seemed to lead to the edge of the world. The rental car she'd picked up at the airport bounced over ruts and potholes, and she gripped the steering wheel tighter as dust billowed around her windows. When they finally stopped, Sarah stepped out and was immediately struck by the silence. After 3 years of city noise, sirens, traffic, the constant hum of other people's lives, the quiet was almost overwhelming. The wind whispered through tall grass, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the lowing of cattle. The house was bigger than the photographs had suggested, but Henderson had been right about the work it needed. Paint peeled from the siding, one of the porch steps was broken, and several windows were boarded up. But as Sarah walked around the property, she felt something shifting inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief and shame she'd carried for so long. The previous owner ran cattle, Henderson explained, pointing toward the pastures. "There's a good well, and the fencing is mostly intact. You'd need to hire help, of course, if you wanted to keep livestock." Sarah wandered toward the barn, her footsteps muffled by the thick grass. Inside, shafts of sunlight filtered through gaps in the wooden walls, illuminating empty stalls and hay bales covered in dust. It smelled of horses and leather, and something indefinable that spoke of honest work and simple lives. "I'll take it," she said, turning back to Henderson. "Sarah, you should think about this. Ranch life isn't easy, especially for someone without experience, and out here you'd be pretty isolated." "I want the isolation," Sarah said firmly. "I want to be somewhere where people don't know my story, where I can just be." Henderson studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, we can have the papers drawn up by tomorrow." That evening, Sarah sat in her hotel room in Cedar Falls, staring at the photographs of the ranch spread across the small table. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by her scars or her past. She pictured herself learning to care for animals, growing vegetables in the rich soil, maybe even learning to ride horses. The next morning, she drove to the local feed store to ask about supplies and contractors. The owner, a gruff man named Pete, looked her up and down with unconcealed skepticism. "You're the city girl who bought the Hernandez place," he said, not a question. "Yes, sir." "You know anything about ranching?" "No, sir, but I'm willing to learn." Pete's expression softened slightly. "Well, I suppose everyone's got to start somewhere. You'll need fencing repair for starters. And if you're thinking of keeping livestock, you'll need feed, veterinary supplies, the works." He handed her a business card. "Jake Morrison does good work. He's got a place about 10 miles north of you. Keeps to himself, but he's honest and fair." Sarah pocketed the card and spent the rest of the day purchasing basic supplies, tools, cleaning supplies, enough groceries to last a week. By late afternoon, she was driving back to her new home, her car loaded with the physical evidence of a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. The sun was setting as she pulled into the gravel driveway, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that she'd never seen in the city. The house looked different in the golden light, less abandoned, more like a place waiting for someone to bring it back to life. As she unloaded her supplies, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the car window. For once, she didn't immediately turn away. The scar was still there, would always be there, but somehow it seemed less important against the backdrop of endless sky and rolling hills. She was home. The Wyoming morning arrived with a bite that cut through Sarah's thin city jacket like a blade. She stood on the sagging porch of her new home, cradling a steaming mug of coffee between her palms, watching the sun paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and amber. The silence was so complete it almost had weight. No traffic, no sirens, no neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls. Just the whisper of wind through prairie grass and the distant call of what she thought might be a hawk. 3 days had passed since she'd signed the papers, and Sarah had thrown herself into the work of making the ranch habitable. She'd scrubbed floors until her knees ached, patched the worst of the holes in the walls, and managed to get the old generator running long enough to restore power to most of the house. But the enormity of what she'd undertaken was becoming clearer with each passing hour. The fence line stretched for miles in every direction, and from what she could see, at least half of it was in desperate need of repair. The barn required more than cosmetic fixes. Several of the support beams were rotting, and the roof had a hole big enough for a grown man to climb through. And then there was the matter of the 20 head of cattle that apparently came with the property, currently grazing in the far pasture and looking skeptical about their new owner's qualifications. Sarah pulled Jake Morrison's business card from her pocket for the dozenth time. Pete at the feed store had described him as reliable, but warned her that Jake wasn't much for conversation. "Lost his wife in a car accident about 5 years back," Pete had said, lowering his voice. "Hasn't been the same since. Does good work, though. Honest as the day is long." She'd called the number twice, but it had gone straight to voicemail both times. The recorded message was brief and gruff. "Morrison, leave a message." She hadn't. Something about asking for help still felt like admitting defeat, even though she knew she was in over her head. The sound of an engine broke through the morning quiet, and Sarah shielded her eyes against the sun to see a battered pickup truck making its way down her drive. The vehicle was older than she was, painted a faded blue that had seen better decades, and it moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her scarf, adjusting it to better hide her scar. She'd been alone for 3 days, and the prospect of human interaction sent familiar butterflies dancing in her stomach. The truck came to a stop near the barn, and she watched as a tall figure emerged from the driver's seat. The man was probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair that needed a trim and shoulders that spoke of physical work. He wore faded jeans, scuffed boots, and a denim jacket that had seen countless seasons. What struck Sarah most was how he moved, with an economy of motion that suggested he never wasted energy on unnecessary gestures. He spotted her on the porch and raised one hand in a brief acknowledgement before walking toward the barn. Sarah set down her coffee mug and made her way across the yard, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Excuse me," she called out when she was close enough to be heard without shouting. "Are you Jake Morrison?" The man turned, and Sarah got her first good look at his face. He had weathered features that spoke of years spent outdoors, and blue eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. When his gaze met hers, she braced herself for the usual reaction. The double take, the poorly hidden shock, the awkward recovery. It never came. Jake Morrison looked at her with the same steady attention he might give a piece of machinery he was evaluating, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "Pete said you might need some help with the fencing." Sarah blinked, thrown off by the lack of reaction to her appearance. Yes, I called, but don't check messages much," Jake said simply. "Figured I'd come take a look." He walked past her toward the nearest fence line, and Sarah hurried to keep up. His legs were longer than hers, and she found herself taking 2 steps for every one of his. When they reached the fence, Jake knelt and examined the posts with the same methodical attention a doctor might give a patient. "Most of these posts are rotted through," he said, standing and brushing dirt from his hands. "You'll need to replace about half of them, maybe more. Wire's in decent shape, though, that's something." "How much would something like that cost?" Sarah asked, dreading the answer. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving across the property with the practiced eye of someone who understood land and livestock. "Depends on how much you want to do yourself versus how much you want to pay for labor." "I'm not afraid of work," Sarah said quickly. I don't know what I'm doing. Most folks don't starting out." Jake's tone was matter-of-fact, without condescension. "You planning to keep the cattle?" Sarah looked toward the distant pasture where the cows grazed, black dots against the golden grass. "I think so. I mean, they're here, aren't they? Seems wrong to just get rid of them. 20 head's a manageable number for someone learning." Jake walked along the fence line, occasionally stopping to test a post or examine a section of wire. "You'll need to check them regular, make sure they're healthy, get them vaccinated, dewormed. Bulls need to be separated from the heifers unless you want calves." The list of responsibilities was daunting, but Sarah found herself nodding. There was something about Jake's calm competence that made her feel less overwhelmed, as if his presence somehow made the impossible seem merely difficult. "I could help you learn," Jake said suddenly, his words so quiet Sarah almost missed them. "If you want." She stopped walking, surprised by the offer. "Really? I mean, I can pay you. Not about money." Jake's eyes met hers again, and Sarah felt an odd flutter in her chest. "Property like this shouldn't go to waste. Your great-aunt, she loved this place. Seems right that someone should give it the care it deserves." "You knew Magdalena?" "Some. She was good people. Kept to herself. But she'd help a neighbor when needed." Jake's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "She mentioned you a few times, said you were an artist." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her scarf. I am. Graphic design mostly. I work on a computer. That's still art." Jake started walking again, and Sarah fell into step beside him. "Magdalena showed me some of your work once. Business cards you designed for the hardware store in town. Said you had a good eye." The idea that her great-aunt had been proud enough of her work to show it to others made Sarah's throat tight with unexpected emotion. She'd felt so disconnected from her family since the fire, so convinced that she was a burden, a reminder of tragedy that everyone would rather forget. They walked the perimeter of the property in companionable silence, Jake occasionally pointing out problems that needed attention or areas where the land showed particular promise. Sarah found herself stealing glances at him, intrigued by his quiet competence and the way he seemed completely comfortable with silence. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally, as they made their way back toward the house. Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was even quieter than usual. "Sometimes people need a fresh start," he said. "Sometimes a place needs someone who'll care about it properly." He paused, his gaze moving across the ranch with something that might have been longing. "And sometimes helping someone else is the only way to help yourself." There was something in his tone that made Sarah suspect he was speaking from experience, but she didn't press. She understood the value of privacy, of being allowed to carry your pain without having to explain it to others. "I'd like that," she said finally. "Your help, I mean, if you're sure." Jake nodded once, a brief, decisive movement. "I'll come by tomorrow morning. We'll start with the fencing closest to the house, work our way out. You'll need proper tools. I can bring what you don't have." "Thank you," Sarah said, and meant it more than she could express. Jake touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed automatic, then walked back to his truck. Sarah watched him go, noting the way he moved with unhurried purpose, the way he seemed to belong to the landscape in a way she envied. As his truck disappeared down the drive, Sarah looked around at her property with new eyes. The work ahead was still daunting, but it no longer felt impossible. She had help, and more than that, she had someone who understood that sometimes the best way to heal was to build something new from the broken pieces of what came before. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain, and Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, new opportunities to prove to herself that she was stronger than her scars suggested. For the first time in 3 years, she was looking forward to tomorrow. The alarm on Sarah's phone buzzed at 5:30 in the morning, dragging her from the deepest sleep she'd had in years. For a moment, she lay still in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the absolute silence that surrounded the old farmhouse. No car alarms, no neighbors stumbling home from late nights, no city buses grinding their way through early morning routes. Just the soft whisper of wind through the eaves and the distant sound of cattle moving through the pasture. She'd been at the ranch for a week now, and her body was already adapting to the rhythm of rural life. Her hands, soft from years of computer work, were developing calluses from the manual labor she'd thrown herself into. Her back ached from scrubbing floors and moving furniture, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from purposeful work rather than stress and anxiety. Jake had said he'd arrive at dawn, and Sarah had learned that when Jake Morrison said something, he meant it exactly. She pulled on her work clothes, jeans that were already stained with paint and dirt, a flannel shirt that had belonged to her father, and the sturdy boots that were becoming more comfortable with each passing day. By the time she heard the rumble of Jake's truck coming down the drive, Sarah had coffee brewing and was standing on the porch, watching the sun paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. The autumn air was crisp enough to make her breath visible, and she pulled her jacket tighter as Jake climbed out of his truck. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. He moved to the back of his truck and began unloading tools, a post-hole digger, a come-along coils of wire, and a toolbox that looked like it had seen decades of use. "I made coffee," Sarah offered, gesturing toward the house. "Appreciate it." Jake paused in his unloading to look at her. "You ready for some real work?" "I think so." Sarah's stomach fluttered with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. "I've never done anything like this before. Everyone's got to start somewhere." Jake shouldered the post-hole digger and headed toward the section of fence they'd examined the day before. The main thing is to not get frustrated when it doesn't go perfect the first time. They worked in companionable silence for the first hour, Jake showing Sarah how to identify posts that needed replacement and how to use the come-along to pull wire tight. His teaching style was patient and methodical. He'd demonstrate a technique once, then watch as Sarah tried it herself, offering quiet corrections when needed. "Keep your back straight," he said as Sarah struggled with the post-hole digger. "Let the tool do the work. You're fighting it instead of working with it." Sarah adjusted her stance and tried again. This time the digger bit into the hard-packed earth more easily, and she managed to create a hole deep enough for Jake's approval. "Better," he said simply, and Sarah felt a flush of pride that was entirely disproportionate to the simple task she'd accomplished. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself stealing glances at Jake as he worked. He moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd spent his life working with his hands, and there was something almost meditative about the way he approached each task. He never seemed hurried, never appeared frustrated when something didn't go according to plan. "You're good at this," Sarah said as they took a break around mid-morning, sharing coffee from the thermos she'd brought out. Jake shrugged, his attention focused on the fence line they'd been repairing. "Practice. How long have you been ranching?" "All my life, pretty much. Grew up on a place about 30 miles north of here. When I got married, my wife and I bought a smaller spread closer to town." His voice remained steady, but Sarah noticed the way his jaw tightened slightly. "After she died, I sold it. Didn't seem right, trying to work it alone." Sarah felt a stab of recognition. The way Jake talked about his wife, or rather the way he didn't talk about her, reminded her of her own struggle to discuss her parents. Some losses were too big for casual conversation. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Happens." Jake's tone was matter-of-fact, but Sarah could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. "Point is, I know what it's like to start over, to look at something that used to make sense and not know how to make it work anymore." They returned to work without discussing it further, but Sarah felt a shift in the dynamic between them. They were both carrying their own grief, their own need to rebuild, and somehow that shared understanding made the work feel less lonely. Around noon, Jake straightened from the post he'd been setting and looked toward the road. "You expecting company?" Sarah followed his gaze and saw a cloud of dust approaching, kicked up by what looked like a pickup truck moving faster than necessary on the dirt road. Her stomach clenched with the familiar anxiety that came with unexpected visitors. The truck pulled into the yard, and Sarah recognized it as belonging to Pete from the feed store. But it wasn't Pete who climbed out of the driver's seat. It was a woman about Sarah's age, with short auburn hair and the kind of confident stride that suggested she was comfortable anywhere she went. "You must be Sarah," the woman said, extending her hand as she approached. "I'm Emma Patterson. I own the place about 5 miles south of here." Sarah shook Emma's hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of someone who worked with her hands. "Nice to meet you." Emma nodded to Jake, who touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "Jake, how's the fencing coming along?" "Making progress," Jake replied, his tone neutral. Emma turned back to Sarah, and Sarah braced herself for the usual reaction. But like Jake, Emma seemed to look past Sarah's scars to focus on her eyes. "I wanted to stop by and welcome you to the neighborhood," Emma said. "Also wanted to let you know that we're having a community barn raising next Saturday. The Hendersons lost their main barn to that storm we had last month, and we're all pitching in to help them rebuild." Sarah's heart sank. A community gathering meant crowds, meant being the center of attention, meant curious stares and whispered conversations. "That's very kind, but I'm still getting settled." "Perfect time to meet people," Emma said cheerfully. "Besides, you'll need to know your neighbors out here. When winter comes, we all look out for each other." "I don't know anything about barn raising," Sarah said, grasping for an excuse. "Neither did I when I first moved here," Emma laughed. "I was a lawyer in Denver before I inherited my grandfather's ranch. Talk about a learning curve. But the thing about communities like this is that everyone's willing to teach if you're willing to learn." Jake had been listening to the conversation without comment, but now he spoke up. "Sarah's got good instincts for the work. She'd be helpful." Sarah looked at him in surprise. She'd expected him to understand her reluctance, to help her find a way out of the invitation. Instead, he was encouraging her to accept. "It's settled then," Emma said. "We start at dawn and there'll be plenty of food. The whole county turns out for these things." After Emma left, Sarah and Jake returned to their work, but the rhythm felt different. Sarah was distracted, her mind spinning with anxiety about the barn raising. The idea of being surrounded by people, of being the newcomer that everyone wanted to get a look at, made her stomach churn. "You don't have to go," Jake said quietly, reading her mood with the same ease he showed when evaluating fence posts. "You think I should, though?" It wasn't a question. Jake was quiet for a long moment, using the come-along to tighten a section of wire. "I think hiding gets easier the longer you do it, and I think your aunt would have wanted you to be part of the community. What if people stare? What if they ask questions? Some will, some won't." Jake's tone was matter-of-fact. "But if you never give people a chance to see past the scars, they never will." His words hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She'd spent 3 years assuming that her scars defined how people saw her, but she'd never given anyone the chance to prove her wrong. "Will you be there?" she asked. "Wasn't planning on it." Jake's expression was carefully neutral. "Don't much care for crowds. But you think I should go? I think you should do whatever feels right to you." Jake shouldered his tools as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon. "But I also think you might be surprised by how little people care about the things you think they care about." As Jake loaded his truck, Sarah found herself looking at the fence they'd repaired. It wasn't perfect. Some of the posts were slightly crooked, and her technique with the wire stretching had been inconsistent, but it was solid, functional, and it would keep the cattle where they belonged. Maybe that was enough. Maybe perfection wasn't the goal. Maybe the goal was simply to build something that would hold. "Same time tomorrow?" Jake asked, pausing with his hand on the truck door. "Yes," Sarah said, and then, surprising herself, "And Jake, thank you for saying I'd be helpful, even if I don't feel like it yet." Jake's expression softened almost imperceptibly, feeling like it comes after doing it, not before. As his truck disappeared down the drive, Sarah stood in the growing twilight, looking at the work they'd accomplished. Her hands were blistered, her back ached, and she was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the physical labor. But for the first time in 3 years, she felt like she was building something instead of just surviving. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to take the first step toward the barn raising, toward the community that was waiting to welcome her, scars and all. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that made the Wyoming sky look like it had been painted with a master's brush. Sarah stood in front of her bedroom mirror, her hands trembling as she adjusted her hair for the dozenth time. The barn raising was in 2 hours, and she'd changed clothes 3 times already, settling finally on dark jeans, a blue flannel shirt, and her father's old work boots. The scarf lay on her dresser, a security blanket she'd worn every day for 3 years. Today, she left it there. The drive to the Henderson Ranch took 20 minutes on winding country roads, and with each mile, Sarah's anxiety ratcheted higher. She'd barely slept the night before, her mind cycling through every possible disaster scenario. What if people stared? What if someone asked about the fire? What if she did something wrong and embarrassed herself in front of the entire community? She almost turned around 3 times, but the memory of Jake's words kept her moving forward. If you never give people a chance to see past the scars, they never will. The Henderson property was already bustling with activity when Sarah arrived. Pickup trucks lined the driveway, and the sound of voices and laughter drifted across the yard. Sarah parked at the edge of the gathering, her palms sweating against the steering wheel. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, the same words she'd used to get through the worst days after the fire. "You can do this." The moment she stepped out of her car, Sarah felt the weight of curious glances. A few conversations paused, and she caught the subtle turning of heads that she'd learned to recognize over the years. But before her courage could fail completely, Emma Patterson appeared at her elbow. "Sarah, you made it!" Emma's genuine enthusiasm was like a warm blanket on a cold day. "Come on, let me introduce you to people." Emma guided Sarah through the crowd with the confidence of someone who'd never met a stranger. "This is Sarah Martinez. She's taken over the old Hernandez place. Sarah, this is Bill Henderson, whose barn we're rebuilding." Bill Henderson was a man in his 60s, with weathered hands and kind eyes. He clasped Sarah's hand firmly, and his gaze never wavered from her face. "Mighty glad to meet you, Sarah. Sorry about the circumstances that brought you here, but we're glad to have you in the community." "Thank you," Sarah managed, surprised by the warmth in his voice. "Your great-aunt was good people," Bill continued. "She helped my family through some tough times when we first started out. If you're half the person she was, you'll fit right in." The introductions continued in a blur of names and faces. There was Mary Chen, who ran the local veterinary clinic and promised to come check on Sarah's cattle. Tom Bradley, whose family had been ranching in the area for 4 generations, offered to help with her first cattle sale. Janet Murphy, who taught at the local school, invited Sarah to the monthly book club meeting. Some people did stare, Sarah noticed. A few conversations grew quiet when she passed, but for every curious glance there were 2 genuine smiles. For every whispered comment, there were 3 offers of help or friendship. "See?" Emma said quietly as they walked toward the construction site. "Not so scary after all." The barn raising itself was a carefully orchestrated dance of community cooperation. The foundation had been poured earlier in the week, and today's work involved raising the frame, a task that required precise timing and plenty of hands. Sarah watched in fascination as teams of men and women worked together to lift massive wooden beams into place, their movements coordinated through years of practice. "Ever done any construction work?" asked a voice behind her. Sarah turned to find a young man about her age, with sandy hair and an easy smile. "I'm sorry, construction work, building things." He gestured toward the rising barn frame. "I'm David Chen, Mary's son. I saw you talking to my mom earlier." "Oh no, I've never done anything like this." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm not sure I'll be much help." "Everyone starts somewhere," David said, echoing Jake's words from earlier in the week. "Why don't you come with me? We're working on the smaller sections first. Good place to learn." Sarah found herself assigned to a team led by David and an older woman named Ruth, who had the kind of no-nonsense efficiency that made complex tasks seem manageable. They were working on constructing the barn's side walls, a process that involved measuring, cutting, and joining pieces of lumber with satisfying precision. "Hand me that 2x4, Ruth said, pointing to a pile of lumber. "No, the longer one, that's it." Sarah threw herself into the work with the same determination she'd brought to learning fence repair. Her hands weren't as skilled as the others, and her measurements weren't always perfect, but she was learning. More importantly, she was contributing. "You're getting the hang of it," David said as Sarah successfully completed her first joint. "My mom mentioned you're learning to ranch. How's that going?" "It's harder than I expected," Sarah admitted, holding a board steady while David nailed it in place. "But I'm getting help. Jake Morrison's been teaching me." "Jake's good people," Ruth said, looking up from her work. "Been through some tough times, but he's solid. You couldn't ask for a better teacher." "He doesn't say much," Sarah said, surprising herself with the comment. "Jake's always been quiet," David laughed. "But when he does speak, it's usually worth listening to. He and his wife used to come to all these community events. Haven't seen him at one since she died." Sarah felt a pang of guilt. Jake had encouraged her to come to the barn raising, but he'd chosen to stay away himself. She wondered if her presence in the community was making his own isolation more difficult. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself falling into the rhythm of the work. Her initial nervousness faded as she focused on the tasks at hand, and she began to appreciate the satisfaction of building something with her own hands. The conversations around her were easy and inclusive, talk of weather and cattle prices, upcoming harvest festivals, and the high school football team's chances in the playoffs. Around noon, the work stopped for lunch, and Sarah found herself swept along with the crowd toward long tables laden with food. The spread was impressive: casseroles, sandwiches, homemade bread, and desserts that looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine. "First rule of community events," Emma said, appearing at Sarah's elbow with 2 plates. "Never turn down food made by ranch wives. These women could cook for an army." Sarah accepted the plate gratefully, her stomach reminding her that she'd been too nervous to eat breakfast. She was looking for a quiet place to sit when she heard her name called. "Sarah, over here." Janet Murphy was waving from a table where several women were seated. Sarah approached hesitantly, still not entirely comfortable being the center of attention. "We were just talking about you," Janet said as Sarah sat down. "Mary mentioned you're a graphic designer. That's exactly what we need for the autumn festival." "Festival?" Sarah asked. "Every October we have a harvest festival in town," explained Carol Williams, who introduced herself as the mayor's wife. "It's a big fundraiser for the school and the volunteer fire department. But our usual person who does the promotional materials moved to Colorado last month. We need flyers, posters, maybe a logo," Janet continued. "Nothing fancy, just something that captures the spirit of the community." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of excitement. It had been months since she'd had a real design project, something that mattered beyond the small freelance jobs she'd been taking to pay the bills. "I'd be happy to help," she said, and meant it. "Wonderful," Carol beamed. "Can you come to the planning meeting on Tuesday? We meet at the community center at 7. As lunch wound down, Sarah found herself genuinely reluctant to leave. The work resumed with renewed energy, and she threw herself into it with growing confidence. Her hands were blistered and her back ached, but she felt more alive than she had in months. Late in the afternoon, as the barn's frame stood complete against the sky, Sarah stepped back to admire what they'd accomplished. In one day, a community had come together to transform a pile of lumber into the skeleton of a building that would serve the Henderson family for generations. "Pretty amazing, isn't it?" Emma said, joining her. "I can't believe we did all this in one day," Sarah replied, wiping sweat from her forehead. "That's what community means out here," Emma said. "When someone needs help, everyone pitches in, and when you need help, everyone will pitch in for you too." As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself helping to clean up, loading tools into trucks and folding tables. The work felt natural now, part of the rhythm of community life that she was beginning to understand. "Sarah." She turned to find Jake Morrison standing behind her, his expression unreadable. Her heart skipped. She hadn't expected to see him here. "Jake, I didn't know you were coming. Wasn't planning to." He glanced around at the completed barn frame, then back at her. "Heard you were here, thought I'd check on you." "I'm okay," Sarah said, and realized she meant it. Better than okay, actually. Jake studied her face, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression. "You look different." "Different how?" "Lighter," Jake said simply, "like you're not carrying as much weight." Sarah looked around at the people who were still working, cleaning up after a day of shared labor. Many of them had already made her feel welcome, had looked past her scars to see something worth knowing. "I think I'm starting to understand what you meant," she said, "about giving people a chance." Jake nodded slowly. "They're good people. They'll take care of you if you let them." "What about you?" Sarah asked. "Don't you want to be part of this again?" Jake's expression grew guarded. "That's different." "Is it?" For a moment, Jake didn't answer. Then he said quietly, "Maybe." Maybe it's time I stopped hiding too. As they walked toward their vehicles, Sarah felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She'd faced her fears, contributed to something meaningful, and found acceptance in a community she'd been afraid to join. Most importantly, she'd helped someone else see that healing was possible. The barn raising was over, but Sarah's real construction project was just beginning. The careful, deliberate work of building a new life from the foundation up. The first week of November brought unseasonable warmth to Wyoming, the kind of weather that made ranchers nervous and meteorologists checked their instruments twice. Sarah stood in her kitchen, sipping coffee and watching the morning news on the small television she'd finally gotten working. The weatherman was talking about an approaching storm system, complete with animated graphics showing swirling clouds and temperature drops that would make the recent warmth seem like a distant memory. "Folks, this is going to be a significant weather event," the meteorologist was saying. "We're looking at possible blizzard conditions across the entire region, with winds up to 60 miles per hour and snow accumulations of 12 to 18 inches. If you're in a rural area, now's the time to make sure you're prepared." Sarah's stomach tightened. She'd been in Wyoming for a month now, long enough to understand that winter here wasn't the mild inconvenience it had been in her Denver apartment. Out here, winter could be a matter of life and death. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Storm coming? Need to prep cattle? Be there in hour." Sarah looked out at her 20 head of cattle, currently grazing peacefully in the pasture, as if they had no idea their world was about to change. She'd grown attached to them over the past month, learning their individual personalities and quirks. There was Bessie, the old cow who always seemed to know when storms were coming, and Thunder, the young bull who thought he was tougher than he actually was. By the time Jake arrived, Sarah had already moved the cattle closer to the barn and was working on securing loose equipment around the property. She'd learned to read the signs in Jake's posture and expression, and today he moved with the focused urgency of someone who'd weathered enough storms to know what they could do. "How bad is it going to be?" Sarah asked, as Jake began unloading supplies from his truck. "Bad enough," Jake replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "We need to get the cattle into the barn. Make sure they have enough feed and water for at least 3 days. Power's likely to go out, so we need to check the generator." They worked with practiced efficiency, their partnership honed by weeks of shared labor. Sarah marveled at how naturally they moved together now, anticipating each other's needs without having to speak. Jake would start toward the feed storage, and Sarah would already be opening the door. Sarah would struggle with a heavy gate, and Jake would appear at her elbow to help. "You've gotten good at this," Jake said, as they herded the cattle into the barn. "Month ago, you couldn't tell a heifer from a steer." "I had a good teacher," Sarah replied, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. Over the past month, their relationship had shifted in ways Sarah was still trying to understand. The quiet companionship of their working partnership had deepened into something more personal, more intimate. They'd begun sharing lunch together, sitting on the porch steps and talking about everything and nothing. Jake had started staying later, helping with projects around the house that weren't strictly ranching related, but neither of them had acknowledged the change directly. They moved around it carefully, like people walking around a beautiful but fragile thing they were afraid to disturb. "Storm should hit around midnight," Jake said, checking his watch. "I should head home, make sure my own place is secure." "How far is your place?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "About 15 miles north." Jake paused in his work, studying the darkening sky. Roads might be impassable by tomorrow. The implication hung in the air between them. If Jake left now, they might not see each other for days, possibly weeks if the storm was as bad as predicted. Sarah felt an unexpected pang of loss at the thought. "You could stay," she said quietly, not looking at him. "I mean, if you think the roads might be dangerous." Jake was quiet for a long moment. "That might be smart," he said finally. "Storm like this, it's good to have someone around." They spent the rest of the day preparing for the storm, checking and double-checking every detail. Sarah had never been through a serious blizzard, but Jake's methodical approach was reassuring. They brought extra firewood into the house, filled every available container with water, and tested the generator twice. As evening approached, the wind began to pick up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the yard. Sarah cooked dinner while Jake made a final check of the livestock, and when he came back inside, his cheeks were red with cold. "Temperature's dropping fast," he said, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. "Won't be long now." They ate dinner in the kitchen, the television providing background noise as weather updates grew increasingly dire. Sarah found herself stealing glances at Jake across the small table, acutely aware of his presence in her space. He'd been in the house many times over the past month, but always briefly, always with the understanding that he'd be leaving soon. Tonight felt different. Tonight he was staying. "I should take the couch," Jake said after they'd finished eating. "Don't want to impose." "Don't be ridiculous," Sarah replied. "There's a guest room upstairs. It's not much, but it's better than the couch." As if summoned by their conversation, the wind chose that moment to give the house a particularly violent shake. The lights flickered, and somewhere in the distance Sarah heard the crash of something falling, probably a tree branch or a piece of loose siding. "Here it comes," Jake said grimly. The storm hit with a ferocity that took Sarah's breath away. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling every window and door in the house. Snow began as scattered flakes, but quickly intensified into a wall of white that made it impossible to see beyond the porch. Sarah and Jake sat in the living room, listening to the storm rage outside. The power went out around 10 o'clock, plunging them into darkness broken only by the flickering light of the fire Jake had built in the old stone fireplace. "I've never heard wind like that," Sarah said, pulling a blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Prairie storms can be brutal," Jake replied. "Nothing to stop the wind out here, so it just builds and builds until it hits something." As if to emphasize his point, something large crashed into the side of the house, making Sarah jump. Jake was on his feet immediately, flashlight in hand. "I should check the barn," he said. "Make sure the cattle are okay." "You can't go out in this," Sarah protested. "It's too dangerous." "They're my responsibility now too," Jake said quietly. "If something happens to them, because I didn't check." Sarah felt her heart clench at the care in his voice. Over the past month, Jake had become as invested in her ranch as she was, treating her livestock and her land as if they were his own. "Then I'm coming with you," she said, reaching for her coat. "Sarah, no. It's too dangerous for someone without experience." "It's my ranch," Sarah said firmly. "My cattle. I'm not sending you out there alone." Jake looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. "Stay close to me," he said finally, "and if I tell you to go back to the house, you go." The journey to the barn, usually a 2-minute walk, took 15 minutes in the howling wind and driving snow. Sarah could barely see Jake's form ahead of her, even though he was close enough to touch. The cold was like nothing she'd ever experienced, cutting through her layers of clothing as if they were made of paper. Inside the barn, the cattle were huddled together, their breath creating clouds in the frigid air. But they were safe, and that was what mattered. "We should stay until the wind dies down," Jake said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Too dangerous to make the trip back right now." They settled into the hay bales, wrapping themselves in old horse blankets they found in the tack room. The barn provided some shelter from the wind, but it was still brutally cold. Sarah found herself shivering despite the blankets, her teeth chattering. "Come here," Jake said quietly, opening his arms. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, then moved closer, letting Jake pull her against his side. The warmth of his body was immediate and overwhelming, and she felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Better?" he asked. "Much better," Sarah replied, surprised by how right it felt to be in his arms. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside and the quiet sounds of the cattle settling for the night. Sarah found herself acutely aware of Jake's heartbeat against her ear, the steady rhythm reassuring in the chaos of the storm. "Jake," she said finally, "can I ask you something?" "Sure." "What was she like? Your wife?" Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with memory. "Her name was Linda. She was like sunlight, always smiling, always seeing the best in people. She could make friends with anyone, make anyone feel welcome." He paused and Sarah felt him take a shaky breath. "She would have liked you. What happened to her?" "A car accident. Black ice on a country road. She was coming home from a church meeting and..." Jake's voice broke slightly. "I was supposed to pick her up, but I was working late, fixing a tractor that could have waited until morning. She said she could drive herself, that it wasn't a big deal." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the pain in his voice. "It wasn't your fault." "I know that," Jake said. "In my head I know that, but knowing something and feeling it are different things." "Yes," Sarah said quietly, "they are." They were quiet again, and Sarah found herself thinking about the parallels in their stories. Both of them had lost people they loved. Both of them carried guilt that logic couldn't touch. Both of them had been trying to rebuild their lives from the ashes of tragedy. "Sarah," Jake said suddenly, "can I ask you something now?" "Of course. Why did you really come here? I mean, I know about your parents, about the insurance money, but you could have gone anywhere, done anything. Why a ranch in the middle of nowhere?" Sarah considered the question, trying to find words for feelings she'd never fully examined. "I think I was looking for a place where I could be invisible," she said finally, "where no one would know my story or judge me for my scars. But also, I think I was looking for a place where I could be useful again, where I could build something instead of just surviving." "And have you found it?" Sarah lifted her head to look at him, struck by the intensity in his blue eyes. "I think I have. But it's not just the place, it's the people too. It's you." The words hung between them, more honest than anything Sarah had said in years. Jake's expression grew soft, and he reached up to touch her face, his thumb tracing the line of her scar with infinite gentleness. "You're beautiful," he said quietly. "Not despite the scars, not because of them, just beautiful." Sarah felt her breath catch. "Jake, I know this is complicated," he said. "I know we both have things we're still working through. But I need you to know that being with you, working with you, watching you build this life, it's made me want to try again, to stop just surviving and start living." The storm was still raging outside, but inside the barn, surrounded by the warmth of Jake's arms and the quiet presence of the cattle they'd protected together, Sarah felt something shift in her chest. The fear that had defined her for so long was still there, but it was no longer in control. "I want to try too," she whispered. Jake leaned down and kissed her, soft and careful and full of promise. When they broke apart, Sarah felt as if she was seeing the world clearly for the first time in years. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the Wyoming landscape. But inside the barn, two people who had thought they were beyond hope had found something worth believing in again. Spring arrived in Wyoming with the kind of dramatic flair that made Sarah understand why people wrote poetry about the changing seasons. The snow that had blanketed the ranch for months melted in rushing streams, revealing grass so green it almost hurt to look at. The cattle, released from their winter confinement, grazed with obvious joy in the expanding pastures, and Sarah found herself standing on the porch each morning, coffee in hand, marveling at the transformation. 6 months had passed since the storm that had changed everything. 6 months since Jake had kissed her in the barn and told her she was beautiful. 6 months since they'd both decided to stop surviving and start living. The changes went deeper than the season. Sarah caught her reflection in the kitchen window and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. Her face was tanned from hours of outdoor work, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her hands bore the calluses of someone who built her life with her own labor. But more than that, there was something in her eyes that had been missing for years, a sense of belonging, of purpose, of home. "Morning, beautiful," Jake's voice came from behind her, followed by the familiar warmth of his arms around her waist. "Morning yourself," Sarah replied, leaning back against his chest. Even after 6 months, the easy intimacy between them still sometimes surprised her. Jake had moved in gradually, first keeping clothes in the guest room, then shifting to the main bedroom, then finally bringing his furniture and officially combining their lives. "Emma called," Jake said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "She wanted to know if we're still planning to host the spring roundup here next month." Sarah smiled. The spring roundup had become a community tradition, a way for the local ranchers to work together in moving cattle to summer pastures. When Sarah had volunteered to host it on her property, she'd been nervous about having so many people on the ranch. Now, she was looking forward to it. "Of course we are," she said. "I've been planning the menu for weeks." "I know you have," Jake laughed. "You've got it written out in 3 different notebooks." "Organization is important," Sarah protested, but she was smiling. Jake had learned to recognize and appreciate her city girl tendency to overplan everything, just as she'd learned to appreciate his instinctive understanding of ranch life. As they stood on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that first day when she'd stood in Henderson's office, looking at photographs of a run-down ranch and dreaming of a fresh start. The ranch itself had been transformed. The fence lines were all repaired and properly maintained. The barn had a new roof and freshly painted stalls. The house had been renovated from top to bottom, with Sarah's design sense creating a warm, welcoming space that honored the building's history while making it thoroughly modern. But the bigger transformation had been in Sarah herself. The woman who had hidden behind scarves and avoided eye contact had become someone who could stand in front of a room full of people and present the promotional materials for the autumn festival. The woman who had been afraid to let anyone see her scars had become someone who could help deliver a calf in the middle of the night and never once think about covering her face. "I have something for you," Jake said suddenly, pulling back from their embrace. It's not my birthday, Sarah said, turning to face him. Don't need a birthday to give someone a gift, Jake replied, but there was something in his voice that made Sarah look at him more carefully. He seemed nervous, which was unusual for Jake. In the 6 months they'd been together, she'd seen him calm and competent in every situation, from medical emergencies with the livestock, to dealing with difficult neighbors, to weathering storms that would have terrified most people. Jake, what's wrong? She asked. Nothing's wrong, he said quickly. I have something I want to give you, and I want to say some things first. Sarah's heart began to beat faster. Okay. Jake took her hands in his, and Sarah noticed that his were trembling slightly. Sarah, when I met you, I was convinced that the best part of my life was behind me. I thought I was done with hoping for things, done with believing that happiness was possible. Jake, let me finish, he said gently. I need to say this. Sarah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. You changed everything, Jake continued. Not just because you're beautiful, though you are. Not just because you're smart and funny and braver than you think you are, though you're all those things too. You changed everything because you made me remember what it felt like to have a future worth looking forward to. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. You did the same for me. I know, Jake said, his voice soft. That's what makes this so perfect. We saved each other. He released her hands and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Sarah's breath caught as he dropped to one knee on the porch they'd built together, on the ranch they'd restored together, surrounded by the life they'd created together. Sarah Martinez, Jake said, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring with a diamond that caught the morning light. Will you marry me? For a moment, Sarah couldn't speak. The ring was beautiful, but more than that, it represented everything she'd never thought she could have. Love, partnership, a future built on shared dreams and mutual support. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, of course, yes. Jake slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that were no longer trembling, then stood to kiss her with the kind of passion that spoke of promises kept and dreams fulfilled. I love you, he said against her lips. I love you too, Sarah replied, and the words felt like coming home. They were interrupted by the sound of vehicles coming up the drive, and Sarah pulled back to see Emma's pickup truck, followed by several others. Did you know they were coming? Sarah asked. Jake grinned, looking more relaxed than she'd seen him in months. I may have mentioned to Emma that this morning would be a good time to stop by. The trucks disgorged what looked like half the county, including Emma, the Hendersons, David Chen and his mother, and at least a dozen other people Sarah had come to think of as family. Emma was carrying what looked suspiciously like a champagne bottle, and Bill Henderson had a basket that probably contained enough food to feed an army. Well, Emma called out as the crowd approached the porch. Did she say yes? Jake and Sarah looked at each other and burst out laughing. She said yes, Jake confirmed, and the cheer that went up could probably be heard 3 counties over. What followed was an impromptu engagement party that lasted most of the day. The champagne was opened, the food was distributed, and Sarah found herself surrounded by people who had become more than neighbors. They'd become the family she'd never thought she'd have again. I can't believe you all planned this, Sarah said to Emma, as they stood in the kitchen, watching through the window as Jake and some of the men examined his latest cattle purchase. Are you kidding? Emma laughed. We've been waiting for months for Jake to work up the courage to propose. The whole county's been taking bets on when it would happen. The whole county? Small town, Sarah. We don't have cable, so we have to make our own entertainment. Sarah shook her head, but she was smiling. The idea that her relationship with Jake had been the subject of community speculation should have been embarrassing, but instead it felt like being embraced by a large, slightly nosy family. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her here. 3 years ago, she'd been a broken woman hiding in a Denver apartment, convinced that her scars made her unworthy of love or happiness. Now she was surrounded by people who saw her as she truly was. Not the woman marked by tragedy, but the woman who had rebuilt her life from the ground up. You know what the best part is, Jake said, appearing at her elbow as the party began to wind down. What? We get to build the rest of our lives together, all of it. The good days and the bad days, the easy seasons and the hard ones. We get to face all of it together. Sarah looked around at the ranch they'd restored, at the friends who'd become family, at the man who'd seen past her scars to the woman she could become. You know what you said to me that day in the barn, she said. During the storm. Which part? You said I was beautiful, but that's not what convinced me you were different. Jake raised an eyebrow. No, Sarah said, smiling. What convinced me was that you never once made me feel like I needed to be different than I was. You never tried to fix me or change me. You just accepted me. That's what love is, Jake said simply. Accepting someone exactly as they are while helping them become who they want to be. As the last of their guests departed, Sarah and Jake stood together on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. The ranch was quiet now, settling into the peaceful rhythm of evening, and Sarah felt a deep contentment that had nothing to do with the champagne she'd consumed. "So," Jake said, pulling her close, "what do you want to do first as an engaged couple?" Sarah laughed. "Check on the cattle. Make sure they have enough water for the night. Maybe fix that loose board on the barn door." "Very romantic," Jake said, but his tone was warm with affection. "It is romantic," Sarah replied, and she meant it. "This is our life, Jake. The everyday, ordinary, beautiful life we've built together. That's the most romantic thing in the world." Later that evening, as they walked through the pastures in the gathering dusk, Sarah caught sight of their reflection in the stock tank, two figures silhouetted against the sky, working together with the easy partnership that had become second nature. "You know what?" Jake said suddenly. "What?" "Looking at you right now in this place we've built together, with this life we've created, you don't just look beautiful, Sarah. You look like home." Sarah felt her heart swell with a happiness so complete, it almost took her breath away. She'd spent years believing that her scars defined her, that they made her less worthy of love and belonging. But Jake had shown her something different, that home wasn't about being unmarked by life's challenges. Home was about finding someone who saw your scars as part of your story, not the end of it. "So do you," she said, reaching up to touch his face. "You look like home too." As they walked back toward the house, Sarah's engagement ring catching the last light of day, she reflected on the unpredictable nature of healing. She'd come to Wyoming looking for a place to hide, but she'd found something much better, a place to belong, a community to call family, and a love that saw her completely and chose her anyway. The ranch spread out around them, golden in the evening light, and Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, scars and all.